Hi, boys and girls, it's Mrs. Batliner, and I'd like to read you a story today that's called Polar the Titanic Bear. One of my teacher friends asked me if I could find a story about the Titanic, so I actually found this story. And the great thing about it is a true story. Now, it's a little bit longer, so you may want to break it up into a couple of days, but I hope you enjoy it. Remember, it is a true story. The story is by Daisy Corning Stone Spedden, illustrated by Lori McCaw. So, boys and girls, it is set in the early 1900s, which is a really long time ago. So, when you see some of the pictures here, it is not going to look like pictures that you are used to. Introduction. I discovered this story about a little boy and his toy bear among the belongings of one of my relatives, Daisy Corning Stone Spedden. It is a true story that Daisy wrote for her only son, Douglas. She painted a cover illustration for it and gave it to Douglas on Christmas Day in 1913 when he was 8 years old. Douglas, or Master as he's called in the story, adored Polar, his beautiful white mohair bear. Polar was made by the famous Steiff Company of Germany and was brought by Douglas's aunt at FAO Schwarz in New York City. Now the oldest toy shop in America, FAO Schwarz still sells Steiff bears. Polar was no ordinary bear. He had several outfits and his own furniture. He took part in all the family celebrations and holidays. Best of all, Polar went along on the Speddens family's world travels. Douglas's parents were very wealthy. They were able to devote their lives to their son, their travels, and their hobbies. Daisy kept detailed diaries and was a photography buff. Her husband, Frederick, loved sailing. Douglas had a nanny, Elizabeth Margaret Burns, whom he called Mattie Boons, because he couldn't quite pronounce her name. The family lived in a fashionable town outside New York City named Tuxedo Park. They spent summers at the seaside near Bar Harbor, Maine, and winters at resorts around the world. The Speddens traveled on luxurious ocean liners that visited exotic ports in the Caribbean, Africa, and the south of France. Douglas was lucky enough to see things that other children only read about, including the Panama Canal and one of the greatest engineering achievements of all time, and the Eiffel Tower, the highest structure in the world in 1912. But life 80 years ago was not perfect, even for the rich. In those days, there was no cure for childhood diseases, such as measles, and children who caught the deadly illness had to be separated from other people during the long recovery period. And traveling from Europe to North America was not simply a matter of a 6-hour flight on a jet. Planes were rare, and the only way to cross the ocean was to spend 7 days on an ocean liner. When the Speddens were able to book passage to America on the Titanic in April 1912, they considered themselves very lucky. The Titanic was the biggest, newest ship in the world, a floating palace that contained every modern convenience and luxury. Douglas and Polar stepped onto the most magnificent passenger ship ever built in a state of great excitement. They never dreamed that they would soon be part of the most famous sea disaster of all time. So there he is. Yeah, so if you notice, they totally look different than what we look now. "That's my 10th bear today," said the voice of a young woman proudly. Suddenly, I felt myself hurled through the air, then landing with a thump on a hard wooden bench. I opened my eyes and looked around the large, bright room littered with sawdust, tools, and scraps of felt. On either side of a long table sat women who were quickly sewing black glass eyes onto teddy bears. I soon learned that they earned their living by making bears and other stuffed animals for toy shops around the world. Christmas was approaching, and they had been given a large order. This special lot of bears, including me, was to be shipped from Germany to America. I wondered where America was, and how was I to get there? But I didn't have long to wait. So, boys and girls, if you notice, the story is told on the perspective of the bear. So even though it's a true story, it's told in the eyes of the bear. So there they are making them all. Take a look at this toy shop. Does it look anything like a toy shop you've ever been in? Now remember, this was early 1900s, like 1912. Okay, so super, super, super long time ago. So it looked totally different than our toy shops now. The next morning, I was crammed into a box, my toes touching my ears. Weeks passed in darkness as I was jostled this way and that. First, there was a rumbling of a baggage train, then the swaying of the ship, then the shouts of the dockhands. But I forgot about my aching limbs when a young woman lifted me out of my box and set me on a shelf with a dozen other bears. She dusted us all off and then tied blue or pink ribbons around our necks. I had arrived at FAO Schwarz in New York, the largest toy shop in the world. I was amazed by the beautiful things I see from my perch. From the ceiling hung every sort of flying machine, airships, aeroplanes, and hot air balloons. In a long case in front of me were little furnishings for dollhouses, tiny bird cages, baby carriages, and bathtubs with china dolls in them. There was a wonderful railway worked by electricity, and I could see a bright red engine going around and around past flashing signal towers and stations. Because it was Christmas time, the shop was busy every day. My bear companions disappeared one by one, and I couldn't help wondering when my turn would come. One day, a lady with red cheeks looked at me all over very carefully, straightening my blue bow, and she said she would take me along with her. I was sad to be leaving my lovely surroundings, and I hated being packed into a horrid little box again by one of the sales clerks. So if you look at the picture above, that is a picture of the FAO Schwarz Maine store. So look how tall it is. Super popular. For several days, I was left in a closet. I thought everyone had forgotten me. But finally, one morning, the lady took me out of the box. Then we went down to the docks where we boarded a large ship called the Carpathia. The decks of the ship were crowded with people saying goodbye. As I looked about, wondering what was to become of me, a little boy came running up. Flinging his arms around the lady with the red cheeks, he cried, "Oh, Aunt Nanny, I wish you were coming with us." She gave him a big hug and then presented me to him. The little boy, my new master, and his father and mother with him, and Nurse Burns, whom he called Muddy Boons. Several people came to see Master's family off, and I was admired by each one of them, which made me feel very proud. "How high he holds his head," Master's father said. "What will you call him?" "Polar." Master replied promptly. So once again, boys and girls, take a look at the picture there. Are they dressing the same way that we dress nowadays? Not at all. So you can see all the different pictures there. A week later, we sighted the island of Madeira near Portugal, which was to be our home for the next few months. It was a beautiful, bright afternoon when we went ashore. We traveled through the busy streets to our hotel in a rickety old wooden cart pulled by a bull. Our hotel was very grand. Master Muddy Boons and I had a big sunny room overlooking the garden and a blue sea beyond. I spent many lazy days out under the palms watching Master build little houses with sticks and stones and surround them with miniature gardens. And we rode in the bullock carts whenever we went into the hills, exploring the different parts of the island. So remember in the very beginning, I said there's different outfits that the bear can wear. So looking at Master and looking at the bear, they're kind of dressed the same. Boys, take a look at his outfit. How many of you would want to wear an outfit like that? One sad day, Master woke up with red spots all over his face. He's got measles, the doctor said gravely. You'll have to put him in quarantine. Everyone looked very worried. Master, Muddy Boons, and I were moved to a little cottage a short distance from the hotel. Master's mother explained that being in quarantine meant staying away from the other guests so that we wouldn't give them the measles. We weren't in our new home for more than 5 minutes before a big brown mouse scampered across the floor. Poor Muddy Boone shrieked and went after it with a broom. She soon named our cottage Mouse Castle because it was full of mice, rats, and ants, and she spent all her spare minutes trying to kill them. I didn't like my new quarters a bit, for Master was too sick to even notice me, and I was put in a corner and forgotten. The doctor visited us often, and every day Master's parents came with fresh eggs and milk. Night after night, I watched as Muddy Boons sat awake, holding Master's hot, limp hand in hers. A full week passed, and I began to wonder if he would ever be well enough to play with me again. But one morning, I heard Master ask for me in a faint little voice. Muddy Boons handed me to him, and he put me on his pillow, and there I lay without stirring the whole day. So we know exactly about quarantine because when we had COVID and we were not able to go outside or go to school, that was a quarantine. So back in the early 1900s, when someone got sick with measles, there was not this shot to kind of not give them the measles. And so they had to stay away from everybody else and pretty sick. Slowly, Master began to grow stronger. He would sit up in bed, wash my face and paws, tie my ribbon, and give me my breakfast. I was so happy to see him better that I almost didn't care what he did to me. But I didn't relish the bath Muddy Boons gave me one morning in a horrid, smelly liquid called disinfectant. She gave Master one too. Then 2 men came to the garden with a hammock. They carefully lifted Master in as he held tight to his little American flag in one hand and me in the other. Muddy Boons led the way, and we all marched back to our own sunny room in the hotel. So after a while, he was able to go back to the hotel. But Muddy Boons had to clean the bear with disinfectant. So all the germs were off the bear. So there he is when he was sick. Early in April, we sailed back to America on a ship called the Adriatic. After we arrived in New York, we went to Master's new home in Tuxedo Park, which was surrounded by trees and overlooked a little lake. When the weather turned hot and sticky, we went to the family summer house near Bar Harbor, Maine. I enjoyed splashing in the ocean with Master or sitting on the rocks while he built forts and castles. Once he forgot about me, and the tide came in and almost carried me out to sea. But luckily, Master rescued me just in time. When winter came, we returned to Tuxedo Park. Master and I tumbled about in the snow and made snowmen. Best of all, he gave me rides in his sled, running as fast as he could across the ice-covered lake while the cold wind whistled in my ears. At Christmas, I had my own tree and new toys to play with. I enjoyed a delicious turkey dinner served on a small table that Master had made for me. So if you can see him in the picture there. And there he is in the sled. In the new year, we sailed away to some hot, sunny places. We went to Panama, where a great canal was being built right through the country so the ships could sail from one side to the other. One of the engineers invited Master, Muddy Boons, and me to ride out to see it in his big private car. Bright flocks of parrots flew from the trees as we roared down the jungle roads. Bermuda was our last stop. Master took me to a beautiful beach where we spent many a long afternoon. We would make sort of a throne out of the sand for me to sit on and say, "Now, Polar, don't you run away. But just stay quiet while I work." So I sat there watching him play and sniffing the salty air. So if you look, there's the canal that he was looking at. Take a look at his bathing suit. How many of you would like to wear a bathing suit like that? Totally different than what we're used to. The next winter, we once more set sail on the Caronia, this time for Algiers in northern Africa. The weather was sunny, so we spent our days on deck, romping about with the other children. The captain and master were great friends, and we were often invited to his room for a cup of tea, as master called his hot water and sugar. In Algiers, we saw Arabs dressed in long, flowing robes. We stayed in a big hotel with a garden where I would sit on a beach with Muddy Boons while master played ball. In February, we celebrated George Washington's birthday. Master invited a few friends. We decorated the table with American flags, and Master dressed in red, white, and blue. After our tea party, we all fished presents from a big bag. So there they are. Once again, you can notice that Polar is dressed like Master. From Algiers, we set sail for the south coast of France. At Monte Carlo, we rode to our hotel on the hill in a funny narrow railway. Master told me it was a funicular railway and that it was pulled along by a cable. Then we went to Cannes, where we stayed for nearly a month. I sat in the hotel garden every morning while Master had an hour's spelling lesson with Muddy Boons. One day, we heard a loud buzzing noise. So boys and girls, because his family was so wealthy, he was able to travel to all these places that I know I'm never going to get to. So it's kind of interesting to look at the pictures and realize that there are all those different places that people can visit. An aeroplane! Master shouted, throwing down his books. Goodness me! Muddy Boons cried, jumping to her feet. We all craned our necks up to the sky and watched as the aeroplane circled overhead. I could see the pilot sitting in the cockpit with his goggles on, and he waved at us before heading out over the sea. So, boys and girls, take a look at that plane. Remember, early 1900s, so the planes then do not look like the planes now. So, yeah, so they were able to see him in his plane. They were able to wave to him. We took the night train to Paris. Strolling in the Tuileries gardens, we saw boys sailing their boats in the fountains and watched hot air balloons rising toward the sky. Master took me partway up the Eiffel Tower one day and told me it was 984 feet high. He was always telling me the height and length of things. I was sorry when it was time to go back to America, for I loved Paris. But Master was excited because we were to sail to New York on the Titanic, a magnificent new ship. Everyone said she was the biggest ship in the world. We were going to be on her first voyage. So there's a Titanic. The Titanic had left England the day before, and her first stop was at Cherbourg, France. We took a train to Cherbourg, and that evening went out to the huge ship on a little tugboat. As we stepped on board, the ship's doctor, who had known all of us on the Adriatic, kissed Master and said, "I see you still have Polar with you, little man." We had fairly smooth weather for the first few days and spent most of our time on deck, where Master would spin his whip top or play ball. But we also loved exploring the great ship. There was a giant staircase with a big glass dome over it. Master sent me flying down the banister one morning. In the ship's gymnasium, we saw bicycles and rowing machines and even a mechanical camel for the passengers to ride on. So, boys and girls, take a look at those pictures. That's like the exercise room. Those bicycles and rowers look nothing like we've had now. There was a lovely sun parlor on the upper deck where we spent our afternoons, and Master allowed a little girlfriend to play with me. We ate in the first class dining saloon. The tables there were covered with stiffy starch white tablecloths and polished silver, and the ship's band played for us every single night. And our stateroom was even bigger than Master's bedroom at home. One day, Master's mother and Muddy Boons went down to the lower deck and had a Turkish bath. They didn't like this hot steam bath one bit, although they did enjoy a cooling dip in the ship's swimming pool afterwards. It was our fifth night at sea. I had been in bed for a few hours when I suddenly opened my eyes. The lights had been turned on. Muddy Boons was dressing Master in a great hurry. So there they are. "Come, we're taking a trip to see the stars," she said. Master's parents were already dressed. They were gathering a few belongings together. I was surprised when I saw Master's mother reach for life belts. Then, seizing me by my little net rack beside Master's bed, she tucked me under his arm. We soon joined a group of people standing in the main hall. Everyone was very quiet, talking in hushed voices. Someone whispered that we had struck an iceberg and that water was pouring into the ship. A young man in uniform helped fasten on Master's life belt. Patting him on the head, he said, "Good boy, little man." Then Master's father told us to follow him to the top deck, where we would climb into one of the life lifeboats. The lifeboat was swinging out from the ship's side, and people had difficulty climbing aboard. Our little party kept together, and when there were about 40 of us in the boat, an officer cried, "Lower away!" And we were let down to the water in awful jerks. Master clasped me in my arms. His eyes were shut tight, and his face was white. We finally reached the water safely and rowed off toward a faint light on the horizon. It was very dark. Aside from the stars and the brilliantly lighted ship that towered above us, we could see nothing. Soon after we left the Titanic, the captain sent up rockets as a distress signal. We all watched the ship steadily, except Master, who was asleep. 2 hours later, we saw the last light go out and heard the dreadful cries that told us it was all over. The great Titanic had gone down. So there it is in the background. It seemed like a horrible dream. The heartbreaking silence and feeling of utter loneliness cast a deep gloom over our little boatload. Toward 3 o'clock in the morning, an icy breeze sprang up, and the sea grew rough. Master opened his eyes and said he felt seasick, but Muddy Boons, who had him on her lap, soon quieted him with a story of Cinderella. About an hour later, someone suddenly shouted, "Here comes a ship!" Looking toward the horizon, we first saw a white light and then some rockets. As the ship gradually approached, we feared she might either run us down or not see us at all, since we had no lantern. But soon she slowed down and then stopped. As the faint mist cleared just before dawn, the new moon was setting, and a star was faintly twinkling in the pink horizon. The first rays of the sun cast a wonderful glow on the icebergs that rose from the ocean all around us. Master suddenly opened his eyes, and looking about him, exclaimed, "Oh, Muddy, look at the beautiful North Pole, with no Santa Claus on it." A woman who had been crying smiled at him through her tears. Our rescue ship, the Carpathia, looked very small amidst the few bits of the wreckage where the huge Titanic had gone down. We finally drew alongside, and the men climbed aboard the Carpathia on rope ladders. The women were hauled up in a sort of a swing, and the children in canvas bags. So there they all are getting on the new ship. Soon everyone had been rescued, except me. I lay alone in the empty lifeboat. Several minutes went by, but nothing happened. Everyone seemed to have forgotten me. My heart began to pound. I imagined being left there, tossed by the waves forever. Would I ever see Master again? Oh, how do you think you would feel if you were the only one left in the boat? Suddenly, I felt a terrible jerk, and then another. The boat swayed dangerously. I nearly fell into the icy water as several sailors pulled the lifeboat up to the decks of the Carpathia. I slid down the ribs of the boat, banging my back against each one along the way, and landed in a puddle. "That's the last of them, then," said a sailor. He turned the boat over with a bang, and I fell onto the hard deck in a wet, miserable heap. I lay there for what must have been hours. Then I heard a kind voice. "Hello there. Fancy seeing you again." It was one of the sailors from the Titanic. He picked me up and squeezed the water out of me, quite taking my breath away. Then he carried me down some stairs and into a warm room. It was full of passengers with blankets around them. Many of them held hot drinks. Polar! A familiar voice shouted from across the room. It was Master. He rushed over and took me in his arms. I was delighted to see him again, too, but I was also rather upset to see that he was holding an ugly little brown bear. His mother had brought it for him in the ship's barber shop, thinking I had fallen overboard. As soon as Master saw me, however, he hugged and kissed me. He took me to bed with him that night and every night after, forgetting all about the other bear. Boys and girls, do you have a favorite stuffed animal that has been your favorite for years and years and years? That's kind of what Polar is to Master. During the next 4 long days, Master and I spent much time as we could on deck, even though it was rainy or foggy every day. But the ship was so crowded, with more than 700 Titanic survivors, as well as the Carpathia's passengers, that there was hardly room to move. Master's mother and Muddy Boons spent hours cutting up blankets to make clothes for people who had none. So that's a long time to be so crowded on a ship. At last, we slowly steamed up north at New York Harbor in the middle of a thunderstorm. We were escorted by several boats full of people taking flash pictures of us. Look at the big parade, Muddy Boons, with no brass band. Master cried as we saw the huge crowds of people and cars lining the docks. We were glad to escape the hubbub with members of the family who had come down to meet us. I was happy to settle down to quiet country life in Tuxedo Park. The experience we had gone through seemed to bring Master and me closer together than ever before. He made a great pet of me and supplied me with 2 new suits of clothes and a little white wooden bed. I often thought back to how I was almost lost on the wide ocean, but I felt much better when Master tucked me beside him in bed each night and whispered softly in my ear, "Good night, Polar." Master goes to school now, and I'm left alone much of the time, but I always look forward to the warm greeting he gives me on his return. He's been a good master, and I hope he will be blessed with a long and happy life. Though I realize that I shall see less and less of him as the years go by, I shall always feel, no matter what happens, that I occupy a large corner of his true and tender heart, and that he will be loyal to me to the end. Epilogue. So an epilogue is like the end of the story, kind of what happens. The letters, diaries, photo albums, and mementos of Daisy Spedden record a way of life that is gone forever. Her family trunk is a time capsule from another world. Turning the pages of Daisy's photo albums, one sees pictures of large houses with beautiful gardens, where elegantly dressed people attended parties. In the winter, they boarded ocean liners to stay at grand hotels in places like Cairns, Madeira, and Bermuda. No one had to work to make a living except the servants who took care of the children and the housework. Few of the small number of people who lived this way 80 years ago seem to have thought their comfortable world would ever come to an end. So there they are. So there's Maddie Boons with Douglas and his mom. There's Douglas in his cowboy outfit. Douglas in the new automobile. The Speddens photo album show that Douglas, their only child, was the focus of their life. Many of Daisy's photographs show him surrounded by beautifully made toys. It was the golden age of toys when new creations such as teddy bears and electric trains sets came into being. Dressing up in costumes was also popular, and the album included photos of Douglas in a cowboy outfit and in a Japanese kimono holding a parasol. His nurse, Elizabeth Margaret Burns, nicknamed Mattie Boons, is often pictured with him since she accompanied Douglas and his parents on all their trips. At the end of one European holiday, the Speddens took a train from Paris to Cherbourg on the morning of Wednesday, April 10th, 1912. Also on the train were other well-to-do Americans, including John Jacob Astor, whom the newspapers called the world's richest man. In Cherbourg that evening, the Speddens, the Astors, and the New York-bound passengers took a small boat, the Nomadic, out to the huge Titanic, which had just arrived from Southampton, England. Then the ship left for Queenstown, Ireland, its last stop before crossing the Atlantic. In her diary, Daisy Speddin records the pleasure shipboard routine on board the luxurious new liner. What the Speddens didn't know that was on Sunday, April 14th, the Titanic's radio operators received 7 ice warnings. At 11:40 p.m. that night, the ship's lookout spotted a large iceberg dead ahead. The iceberg struck the starboard side of the Titanic's bow, and water began to pour into the lower decks of the ship. Daisy and her husband Frederick were awakened by a sudden shock, a grinding noise, and the stopping of the ship's engines. They immediately got dressed and went up on deck, where they were told what had happened. Daisy wrote that it was too dark to see anything except some ice on the forward deck. But she noticed that the ship was already tilting, and so she and Frederick hurried downstairs to awaken Douglas, Muddy Boons, and Daisy's maid. At midnight, the captain ordered the radio operators to call to other ships for help. Minutes later, the crew began to load passengers onto the lifeboats. There were only 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible boats on the ship, room for only half of the more than 2,200 passengers on board. An hour later, crewmen helped Daisy, Douglas, Muddy Boons, and Daisy's maid onto lifeboat number 3. Then, since there seemed to be no more women and children on deck, about 20 men, including Frederick, were allowed to jump in. The boat was lowered 65 feet to the ocean surface. It was so dark that no one could find a lantern. But until dawn, the survivors in the lifeboat number 3 managed to keep track of the other lifeboats from the ship by following the gleam of their lanterns across the water. Just after 2 a.m., the last lifeboat left the Titanic. There were more than 1,500 people still on board the steeply tilting ship. Minutes later, the bow plunged under the water and passengers began to jump overboard. Then the forward funnel collapsed. The Titanic's lights went out for good. The stern tilted high into the air, and then the ship broke in two before it slid beneath the waves. The passengers in lifeboat number 3 couldn't persuade the sailor steering the boat to go back and try to rescue people in the water. He was afraid that their small boat would be drowned underwater by the suction created by the huge Titanic. Excuse me. Just before dawn, the chilled survivors in the lifeboats spied the lights of the approaching steamer. After boarding the rescue ship, the Carpathia, Daisy Speddin wrote to a friend in Madeira describing the ordeal that they had been through. One passage reveals with refreshing honesty what she felt after spending a long, cold, fearful night in the cramped lifeboat. One fat woman in our boat had been dreadful all along for she never stopped talking and telling the sailors what to do. And she inhibited from her brandy flask frequently, never offering a drop to anyone else. It was very cold, too, just before dawn, when a breeze came up and the chilly blast from the iceberg struck us. As we approached the ship, our women promptly sprang up in order to get off first, when she had been warned to sit still, and it gave me the greatest satisfaction to grab her by her life belt and drag her down. She fell flat in the bottom of the boat with her heels in the air, and she was furious because we held her there until we were alongside the Carpathia, when we were all charmed to let her go up in the sling first. In the trying days that followed the disaster, the Speddens worked hard to relieve the suffering of those aboard the Carpathia. Their efforts won them the admiration and friendship of that ship's captain, Arthur Rastron. Daisy and Frederick Spedden were remembered by their fellow survivors for their many kindnesses, and Daisy's records in her diary entry for April 15th that she went to bed worn out both mentally and physically after working all day looking after the people, are special proteges, besides some strong passengers. To her friend in Madeira, she wrote that we spend our time sitting on people who are, and there she is writing all of her things, cruel enough to say that no steerage should have been saved as they weren't human beings. How awful. But the world soon asked the opposite question, demanding why so few people from third class had been rescued, and a popular song about the Titanic would claim that they kept them down below where they were from the first time they were the first to go. Historians now point to the Titanic disaster, which was followed 2 years later by World War I, as the beginning of the end of the era where society was sharply divided between rich and poor. After the Titanic tragedy, the Speddens carried on with their busy lives and travels, much as before. But as Daisy wrote, all the values of our life changed, and the daily incidents which once seemed of such importance to us dwindled into mere trivialities. Sadly, the Titanic disaster was but a foreshadowing of deeper pain to come to the Speddens. Just 3 years after the sinking of the ship, 9-year-old Douglas was killed in a car accident near the family summer camp in Maine. It was one of the first automobile accidents in the state. No one knows what happened to Polar the bear. Daisy Spedden, who kept such meticulous records of all events in her life, stopped writing her diaries at the time of her child's death. But her photograph albums continued, showing Daisy in black morning dress and Frederick with mourning bands. The Speddens had no other children and spent the rest of their lives among close friends and family or traveling. Every winter, after enjoying a few weeks in New York City, they traveled abroad. Returning home each spring, they divided their time between Tuxedo Park and their summer home in Maine. They both lived long lives and died just a few years apart, Frederick in 1947 and Daisy in 1950. Perhaps the words Daisy wrote to her school alumni magazine for the young women graduating in the class of 1933 best show how she remained determined to focus on her good fortune throughout her life. As my mind reverts to the past, filled with the lights as well as the deep shadows that come to so many of us. My fervent wish is that the memories of your life and your friendships may be as happy as mine. So there's the Speddens home in Tuxedo Park. Look at how big that is. Boys and girls, I had no idea that Douglas died in a car accident. So this was super, 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 super long, but I hope you learned some stuff about the past and how the Titanic was such a big part of our history. All right, I will see you the next time.